So I will briefly introduce the idea of this lecture seminar and also I would say several words about our two presenters, two lecturers today, and several words about their lecture in order in fact to make some space for people to come. So as you possibly know, this is the second lecture within the series of lectures with the name Targeted Anti-Gender Politics, which is organized by the Gen Lab of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. And the main idea behind this whole series of lectures, which is going to have 4 lectures in the spring semester, and then we hope we'll continue with this nice tradition in the autumn semester as well, is to try to elaborate anti-gender discourses specifically in Southeast of Europe and the Caucasus, or to give the view from this part of the world on some global events, as will be the case with our today's lecture. So Marija Antić and Ivana Radačić both come from the Institute of Social Sciences Ivo Pilar in Zagreb. I will briefly introduce them. Ivana Radačić is a scientific advisor at the Ivo Pilar Institute. She holds a PhD in law from the University of London in the sphere of women's human rights, and is for years, I could say even decades, engaged mainly in socio-legal studies. Her areas of scientific interests are feminism, women rights, and the relationships between gender, rights, and sexuality. She is currently leading the project of the Croatian Science Foundation under the name Regulation of Prostitution in Croatia. And she has authored the book Sexual Violence, Myths, Stereotypes in the Legal System, issued in 2014, and has co-edited 4 books. Among them, I have to specifically mention Women in Law as one which was very important, I think, not only for me personally, but for the Women's Studies Center in Belgrade as well. She's a member of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls of the Human Rights Council. She teaches at the University Josip Juraj Strossmayer in Osijek and was a guest lecturer at various universities abroad, such as University College London, Inter-European Centre for Human Rights and Democratization, UN University for Peace, University of Kent, Melbourne, Victoria University of Wellington. She has also worked as a legal advisor at the European Court of Human Rights. Marija Antić is a postgraduate doctoral student in sociology at the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Zagreb, and an assistant at the Ivo Pilar Institute of Social Sciences. Her areas of interest overlap very much with Ivana Radačić and are women's and gender studies and social inequalities, and she's currently working on the project Regulation of Prostitution in Croatia. So our today's lecture is being built upon a text which was published in November last year in Women's Studies International Forum under a little bit expanded name. So the Evolving Understanding of Gender in International Law and Gender Ideology Pushback 25 years since the Beijing Conference on Women. And what we will hear today is an elaboration on the use of the term gender in international human rights law, with a particular attention to the social constructionist definition of gender in Istanbul Convention. So this is something of an utmost importance, I would say, in the region that we want to cover at the moment, or at least for the last 3 or 4 years. So it will be argued that anti-gender discourse has a strong potential to undermine the developments in the domain of gender equality. And I want to stress, only 25 years after the Beijing Conference on Women. So I could discuss more. I think this is really, as I said, something of great importance for us today, but I will not take any more time. So Ivana and Marija, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adriana, and hello to everybody. It would be nice to see your faces and meet you personally, but this will also be good. So, okay, Marija and I will give you a presentation. So we will put the PowerPoint on. Have we or not? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Which means I don't see anybody. Okay. And then, of course, we will have time for discussion, for questions and answers. As Adriana mentioned, I am also a member of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, which is a so-called special procedure mechanism, a body of experts of the Human Rights Council. And I can also, if we have time, tell you a bit about the types of communications or the complaints, we call them communications, we have been receiving in relation to the gender backlash. Okay, so let's start. As Adriana mentioned, really gender was introduced as a concept in international law. Not only introduced, but really established as a useful tool in analysis of discrimination against women, firstly, in the 1990s. And it was borrowed from the feminist theory, where the concept was developed in the 1970s to really emphasize that the gender inequality is not a product of biological reality, to challenge basically essentialism, and to show that gender differences are socially established. The norms, the roles, the attributes of women and men are really socially established, and that therefore gender inequality can be addressed through political action, through social norms. And there were different theories in feminism, different ideas about gender as well, but this was the dominant, the social constructionist approach. As feminism was developing further, the concept of intersectionality also became very important in the 1990s, which pointed to the fact that different women will experience gender discrimination differently, as gender-based discrimination will be compounded or intersecting with other forms of oppression based on nationality, ethnicity, race, culture, disability, etc. And then another important development in theory was really the critique of the binary concept of gender and by the queer theories. And so that all will have an influence in international law as well, as we will see. So in international arena, it was first, the term gender was first used in Vienna Conference on Human Rights. And then after that, so in 1993, but it was not defined. So there was the mention of the gender bias, etc., but there was no definition of what gender is. Then in 1994, at the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, again, gender was mentioned over 100 times in the declaration, but again, without a definition, as there was immediately the opposition from certain actors, primarily Vatican, Organization for Islamic Conference, as well as civil society organization, mostly from the US, who really argued for the understanding of women and men as complementary, as the differences being naturally produced and based in biology. So then gender was again discussed during the Beijing conference on women. And it was, there we had a whole, it was the subject of another specific discussion where it was discussed how gender should be defined. And there were different ideas from equating gender with women, from understanding gender as to possibly include the sexual and gender minorities, fear of different understandings of gender, and which at the end resulted with a non-definition. And It's very difficult to not to see anybody and look at the screen and you get confused. So we are here already. So gender is to be interpreted and understood as it was in its ordinary, generally accepted usage. As I said, the opposition was primarily from the Holy See, Organization for Islamic Conference, and conservative North American organization, which argued for understanding of gender as grounded in biological sexual identity of men and women. So after the Beijing conference, we have another mentioning of gender in the statute of the International Criminal Court, the so-called Rome Statute. And there, the same definition as in, or non-definition as in the Beijing Platform for Action was proposed. But because this was an area of international criminal law, the principle of legality required a more defined approach. But so the gender was defined as referring to the two sexes, male and female, within the context of society. So what does that mean is really left not fully explained, as there were writers who argued that it actually, the reference to the context of society could give space for an understanding of gender as a social construction. But then the reference to two sexes, male and female, pointed to a more constrictive, limiting understanding of gender. So definitely we have here a vague approach, or what Osterwald calls constructive ambiguity, which allowed for simultaneous claims to be made in relation to that definition. So basically, since the introduction in international law, the term has been really discussed in oppositional ways, and the definitions reflected this ambiguity, so that because there was no way to define it in a consensual way. Holy See really pushed for this definition to be used on other occasions, and indeed it was used at the outcome document of the Durban conference. But then when the Istanbul Convention was discussed, the decision was to define it really in accordance with the social constructionist approach, or to the way that feminists were discussing it when it was kind of started being used in the 1970s, to point to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for women and men. So this was the first time that we have a clear definition of gender in an international instrument, multilateral international instrument, and which really gave an understanding of gender in line with the feminist social constructionist approach. This is not to say that this was already not established in international human rights law. Actually, it was. This was the same definition was given by the CEDAW committee, the Committee on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, a year before, in its general recommendation, where it explained what it means by the term it uses, which is discrimination against women. So, and it explained that it does not include only discrimination based on sex, whereby sex refers to biological attributes on women and men, but also to gender-based discrimination. Yeah. The other thing that the Istanbul Convention explicitly recognized, again, not something that was new, but it was the first time really explicitly recognized, is prohibition of discrimination on the basis of gender identity. And basically what we were looking at in this paper is whether so the rise of the SOGI, so sexual orientation and gender identity concept in international human rights law, and the reflection of these rights of sexually and gender diverse people in the Istanbul Convention, together with the definition of gender in line with the feminist social constructionist approach, were the triggering moments for the development of anti-gender movements in 2010, which really attacked the so-called gender ideology. So even though there was, as Marija will show you later, even though gender was constantly being attacked since its introduction, there was something new in this discourse on gender ideology. And we were looking at whether the fact that the Istanbul Convention was now settled the understanding of gender in international human rights law and clearly established the prohibition of discrimination on the basis of gender identity, whether these were some of the defining moments in connection to the developments, progressive developments at the national level, which then were the triggers for the national or transnational movements. Because up to 2010, really now I took a lot of your presentation. Up to 2010, the critique remained mainly in theological discourses and at the level of international policy making. So before Marija really tells you more about the development of the movements, their characteristics, and their main targets and actions, let's move to how gender then was understood in the context of developments in relation to the rights of LGBTIQ persons, gender diverse persons, or in the context of rights being developed in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. So the first time we have a resolution on sexual orientation and gender identity was in 2006. We had an attempt 3 years before by Brazil on resolution on discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, but at that time that resolution did not pass. In 2006, so we have a first resolution of the Human Rights Council or UN joint statements, sorry, on human rights violations based on sexual orientation and gender identity. 2 years later, we have another joint statement on human rights, sexual orientation and gender identity. And this time this was followed by an opposing statement sponsored by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which stated that the so-called notions of sexual orientation and gender identity had no legal foundation, and similar position was taken by the Vatican as well. In 2011, we have another significant development in relation to the rights of LGBTIQ plus individuals, which is the first resolution which requested the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to commission a study documenting discriminatory laws and practices and acts of violence against individuals based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. And indeed, the report followed, which considered, for example, homophobia and transphobia as examples of gender-based violence. And there was also a panel discussion on the issue in 2012. So, which of course gave the higher visibility in the UN to the issue of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. In 2014, we have another resolution which required an update of the study. And then in 2016, a very important resolution which established a mandate of the independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So this is another special procedure, so we are the UN working group and the independent expert are the same types of special procedures, except that Victor, the current independent expert, is an individual mandate holder and we are a group of 5 experts. And so his role is, and he was preceded by VT, is to really set up standards and monitor the situation in relation to the rights of LGBTIQ individuals through writing reports, through addressing complaints, and conducting study visits. So we have now a number of soft law documents on SOGI. However, the term gender identity is not defined in these multilateral documents. The only definition, or the definition frequently used by international human rights body, is the Yogyakarta principles. And Yogyakarta principles were first drafted in 2010, but then we have also the update, so +10 in 2020. And they were drafted by the human rights experts as a parallel effort to secure LGBTIQ+ rights. And they define gender identity as referring to each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth, including the personal sense of the body, and other expressions of gender, including dress, speech, and mannerism. As I said, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UN Special Procedures, UN Human Rights Treaty bodies have reference to this definition. So this definition basically added a new dimension to understanding gender, and resulted to further confusion in a way of what is meant by gender, and even some conflicts between the different movements, certain parts of feminist movements and certain parts of trans movement, which played well for the opposition. As we will argue later, we think there is a way really that both definition, the concept of gender identity and gender as understood in feminism really offer us important elements in addressing heteronormativity, patriarchy, misogyny, etc., and that they both really offer some important contributions in understanding these experiences. We basically argue that even though each person, of course, feels or has an individual experience of gender, that this is not formed outside of the social norms which define gender as a system of hierarchy. But Marija will talk about it further on. So before Marija goes on to explain what was new in 2010 with the anti-gender movements, which argued against the so-called gender ideology. Let me summarize again, or let me stress again, that the gender was attacked as a concept from the beginning, primarily by Vatican, and then also Conference for Islamic Organization for Islamic Conference, particularly when gender identity concept started being recognized in international human rights law. But at that time, until the Istanbul Convention, and until as we saw, 2006, basically, when the gender identity was first introduced in the UN spaces, there was no clear definition of the terms. So we were really trying to see in this paper whether, as I said before, whether the fact that now there was explicit recognition of the concept of gender identity, as well as definition of gender in line with the feminist social constructionist approach in the Istanbul Convention, whether this then contributed together with the national developments to the development of the movements. And then the specific progressive developments were calls for same-sex marriage legislation in Europe, less restrictive abortion laws in Latin America, and so let's see what happened then in 2010s.
So, as Ivana mentioned, the emergence of the notion of gender ideology is traced back to the UN World Conferences. And what was really interesting in reading about these discussions was that at the time, Holy See was really up to date with recent feminist writings, since they were really contesting term gender by saying that it is imposing a new worldview, that is saying that sexual identity of people can be adapted indefinitely to fit different purposes. In '94, when preparatory committee meetings were held in New York for the Beijing conference that was going to be held the next year, there were these conservative organizations from US that were saying that the idea of 5 genders is being promoted. It was really interesting because that article from Fausto Sterling was published just a year before. At the same time, feminist advocates in those discussions were really using the term gender just as a proxy for women, and they were really caught off guard with those arguments. After that, the early use of the concept is again associated with the Vatican, referencing the John Paul's declaration that misleading concepts concerning sexuality and dignity and mission of the woman were driven by specific ideologies on gender. At the time, Vatican was arguing for their theology of difference and complementarity, where the men and women were seen as human beings to the same degree, but with specific, different, and complementary roles in life. So for almost 20 years, as Ivana already mentioned, these discussions were really contained to international arena, and they were contained at theological level. And 20 years later, we are seeing this discourse in a national context. And I can say from the example in Croatia, when it first appeared in 2017 during the discussion on ratification of Istanbul Convention, this, so to say, progressive forces or side in this debate was again caught off guard, and it was really just asking why gender, why now, what's the problem with gender? We are already having it in our legislation. Everybody in schools, in universities are learning about gender and gender differences. So it seems the scholarship also referencing gender ideology in 2010s really is saying that is an empty signifier or just a symbolical glue that holds together all these different actors, and that is adapted to fight some specific enemy in some specific time that are not really the same. But when we are looking at the contents of ideology in terms that those proponents are saying that it is fostering the war between sexes, it is promoting homosexuality, it is devaluing motherhood, it is promoting abortion. Those same arguments were really given at these 1990s conferences. So it was really not new, just we didn't know about it at the time when it appeared. So anti-gender movements in these last decades were really, in terms of actors, they were the same as within the UN. So there were state, religious, and civil society actors that formed different national and transnational alliances with this shared discourse on gender ideology and corresponding strategies and objectives. It's also important to note here, maybe that it is really interesting that within the UN, there were also an alliance between Organization on Islamic Conference and the Holy See on these questions. So this main discursive frames that are also recognized by different authors are gender ideology, genderism, gender agenda, or gender theory that are adapted, so to say, geographically. So genderism is really cool in these parts of the world where socialism is our history. So within those discursive frames, these same meanings and key messages were constructed that I already explained. So shared strategies that are recognized between these different movements included propagation of anti-gender discourses, both in traditional media and on social networks, as well as using petitions, protest prayers, marches, or in case of state actors like in a Russian anti-gay propaganda law, specific state mechanism to influence or change educational system legislation, and really to influence and change the public opinion on gender and to reflect traditional Christian values. So the main targets were, as with the UN, LGBTIQ rights and sexual and reproductive rights. So this is just a brief overview of the analysis we conducted. It's not up to date. Ivana just got a new report, so she can maybe later say something more about new developments. So in terms of same-sex marriage, there were protests, but also referendum campaigns, as we know in Croatia and in Slovenia. Croatian referendum campaign was really a preemptive, and it was successful since we introduced the notion of marriage as a union between men and women. So in terms of reproductive rights, the early mobilizations were really in Spain when government, together with conservative civil society, tried to introduce restrictive legislation, but without success. Same thing happened in Poland in 2016 when those protests really stopped government from introducing such legislation, but now in 2021 they really introduced near total abortion ban. Hungary has a specific situation where they introduced the concept of protection of life from the point of conception in the constitution, but at the same time they have a legal status of abortion. In terms of Latin America, Brazil is really seen as the key factor in their fight to liberalize the abortion laws in Latin America, but Bolsonaro promised to veto any changes that would liberalize the abortion laws. He kept that promise. He even appointed a Catholic minister that is really arguing for the ban of abortion in cases of rape. So for the Minister of, I think, women's issues and human rights. So another really important thing in terms of legislation was the ratification of Istanbul Convention. So this gender ideology discourse really resulted in rejection or in prolongation in terms of ratification of the convention. Some specific developments were in Bulgaria, where the Constitutional Court declared that convention did not conform to the constitution. In Slovakia and Hungary, parliaments issued a declaration rejecting the Istanbul Convention. In last year, Poland also announced withdrawal, and Turkey formally withdrew last month by a presidential decision. So in terms of education, which is really the main area that these anti-gender movements are saying that through educational system, gender ideology is being imposed, children are really in a great danger. So even besides the fact that we really had initiatives to introduce sex education before this discourse was being propagated, as in Croatia, they were really not opposed on the issues of gender. They were primarily opposed on the issues of homosexuality and issues like permissive sexual behavior. So these gender-related movements or counter initiatives were really starting in 2011 in France, where those movements asked for deletion of the term gender from educational materials, and later on in Ecuador, Serbia, Argentina. There were also these movements targeting existing sex education curricula and gender-sensitive language. They were organized in Poland and Austria in 2015. In Brazil, the educational materials challenging discrimination and violence against LGBTIQ persons were dubbed as Gay Kit, and their distribution was stopped in 2017 under pressure of these anti-gender movements. And what is really new and important in the European context, that gender studies also came under attack in academia. Hungary denounced them as ideology. Government revoked all permissions to master programs in 2018. And in Poland, cutting in funds for gender studies has also been reported. But maybe the main thing that, or the main objective these movements had was influencing and changing the public opinion. So the tactics for doing that were different. They were having social network campaigns. They were using attractive visuals, young people as faces of the campaigns. They were using also online petitions and giving press conferences. And in terms of reproductive rights, really important were US imported campaigns such as 40 Days for Life and March for Life. So this influencing the public really had long or difficult implications. They resulted in a rejection of Colombian peace accords. It was really an opportunity to end the decades-long civil war in Colombia, and it was really rejected by the public after really ferocious campaigns saying that words like gender commission and LGBT rights were really introducing the gender ideology, which was against traditional and Christian values of Colombian people. Also, as I mentioned before, these campaigns were really important in the rejection or prolongation of or ratification of Istanbul Convention, where consequences are really for women and children in cases of domestic and family violence. Third really important consequence was shrinking access to safe and legal abortion in European countries, where really an increasing number of consensus objections was being reported, and where it mainly in France, Belgium, also in Croatia, and where for the clinics it was easier to deny the legal service than to be recognized as an abortion clinic. So I would like to end this with a call for solidarity on this, so to say, progressive side of this debate or war on gender, because this gender ideology is really an alternative construction of gender, okay, but it produces real harms for both women and LGBT persons. So those different and sometimes opposing interpretations of gender or exclusionary discourses that are being used between different feminists and trans feminists or women's and LGBTIQ movements really, as Ivana already mentioned, played well for these anti-gender movements. So we think that it's really important to find some common ground and to maybe move away from this identity-based understanding of gender, and to try to understand it as a system that operates at different levels and that creates vulnerabilities and privileges for all gendered people. So in that sense, we could maybe form our alliances on different bases, on the basis to paraphrase John Paul, that all people, not just men and women, in that traditional biological sense, that all people are really equal, that they are human beings to the equal value. So that's it. I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Are you done?
Yes, we are. I just one correction. So I said that Yogyakarta principles were first adopted in 2010 and then updated 10 years later, but they were adopted in 2007 and updated in 2017.
Okay, I have shared the text so that all of the participants can also read the text if you would like that in the chat. Now, as I said, I was sorry that you were already done, but let's now open the discussion. You can either use the Zoom provided application for waving. Unfortunately, I cannot see everyone. Oh no, I can. Now with the gallery view, I can see you, so you can just wave if you have a question, or use the wave provided by Zoom, or write your questions in the chat. I will read it to the presenters. So please feel free to give some comments, questions.
Meanwhile, while people are getting their courage, connecting to it. I just wanted to give you some updates, if you want, from the work of the UN working group. Yes. So we received some complaints in relation to the backlash. So what we were seeing that now there were a few proposals by different countries to prohibit any use of the term gender or any reference to gender theory in educational context. So that's new. Then any learning of the Lgbt issues as well by a country. Then we had Poland and how the Constitutional Court phrased the abortion. In Honduras, similarly, where abortion is already prohibited, but now it became a constitutional prohibition. And then what we saw more and more attacks on LGBT communities, hate speech, the so-called LGBT free zones, calls for creation of conversion therapies. I'm not mentioning countries because in the UN system, I mean, I think it's already known, but we are kind of trying not to mention them. Although no, these are all public communications. So yes, this was Poland. Proposals in Hungary, for example, bill which would not allow gender diverse and trans people to change their gender. Also a proposal to define marriage as a union between man and a woman only, and to exclude all non-married individuals and same-sex couples from adoption. Issue of, as I said, of hate speech in many different countries. And yeah, I think I kind of added more or less what the UN working group was reacting to, what complaints we got since we wrote this paper, what came to us as a UN working group. Adriana, we don't hear you. You are muted.
I see that. So I said almost ironic, having in mind, as I said at the beginning, that only 25 years have passed from Beijing. So it's really not ironic, just dangerous and something which fills us with fear. If there are no pressing questions at the moment, I will ask you something which came to me during your presentation. And so my first question would be regarding the first part of the presentation. Do you think that it would be better if already in the 90s, so at when the whole debate about gender has started, if we had at the time more precise definition? So would that in any way influence the later developments, both in legal and in those wider public spheres? That would be one question. And the other question would be something which was mentioned in relation to the 2008 opposition, where Ivana, I think you mentioned that there was an opposition to the idea of gender identity as a concept without a legal foundation. Now, of course, this is very interesting to me because of the idea of concepts having or not having legal foundation, and how they become legally interpretable. For example, this is not something which is, I don't know, which exists for thousands of years, but is something which has a historical merit as well. So that is also interesting in the sense of, in the context of gender ideology, where very often we hear that the notion of gender is unscientific. So it's not having a legal foundation, it's not having some kind of scientific basis. Then Marija also mentioned that it works as an empty signifier. So how do we legally, but then also socially, fill concepts with legal binding matter, or that they stop function as empty signifier, which obviously has some relevance in the public sphere?
Thank you. Very interesting questions, both. You want to start?
Well, maybe in that legal sense it's better that you say, but I think that what they were saying, that there were no binding treaties that were mentioning gender identity, just as they were saying in relation to gender earlier. So I think that is that point of recognition. But there is also this other part where only mentioning or use of the concept without definition really has its, I don't know how to say it, strength that was seen in relation to gender, which was undefined for years, and it is seen today in relation to gender identity, which is still undefined in international law.
Let me try to jump here as well. I mean, would it be better? Maybe, but then maybe we would have that strong backlash even earlier on, because but the problem was that it was not possible to make it because of the opposition, and also not only the opposition from primarily Vatican, but also other state and religious and civil society actors, but also because there were different interpretations within the different movements. So there were internal divisions on how to understand it. When you have a term non-defined, it in a way it allows for more inclusivity, but also for more fractions. So it's always and I think, yes, in a way, when we define something, especially if you legally define it, it gives it a claim to knowledge, to power. Law is a system of power, no, which claims knowledge as well as science. But on the other hand, it also can be problematic, as we see in law. When certain things are defined, categorized, they often do not allow for significant room for variety of experiences. And we here in international human rights law, we do have different usage of gender by the different movements. No, in the beginning, in the 90s, it was primarily, well, first it was primarily used really as a synonym for women, which it was not meant to be, but it was. But then, or to really point to the oppression of women or to the social system which oppresses women. But then in the SOGI movements, it was used differently or in queer theory versus feminist, but then also how to define, because many queer are also feminist, many trans, like, of course there is intersections, but there is also different usages depending on where people need to put the focus for their own struggles. But then what happens is that, yeah, there is frictions within the movements, which play well for the opposition. So I think and still the discussion is ongoing. Still we have discussions in feminist movements and in LGBT movements, you know, like whether we understand things similarly, or if we don't, how can we not fight each other at least? And this is something now that is very, very, very out there. Certain misunderstandings and conflicts, etc. So if I would have to say whether it would be useful, in a way, yes, at least for our purposes. I think it's great now that the Istanbul Convention defines it and gives it a certain level of legitimacy, that an international convention says that. So it's not some, you know, like crazy activist in certain countries. It's really clear recognition of the international human rights law standard. But then possibly that definition was a trigger for what is happening now, because it was perceived as moving too far, maybe. And in terms of how, and I think I kind of answered in a way how things get defined legally, and whether they have no meaning if they are not defined legally. So, I mean, that's again a struggle. So how the terms, especially in international human rights law, get defined. It's through the struggle of people who want to be recognized as humans. The Human Rights Forum is really the place for asserting your humanity, for being included. Paradoxically, what happens is because you are included, or you need to assert your own identity and identity-based politics in order to be recognized in the wider category of human, the paradox is sometimes that now we have like particularization of international human rights law and these identity-based claims, which then run against each other. And I think that's one big problem now in international human rights law and in the world generally. So the argument was that this was not yet legally defined, but nothing is ever, like in the beginning, nothing is legal. I mean, international human rights law developed as an answer to certain historical developments, the Second World War. So things develop, and usually legal terminology is wide enough to open up the space for the new interpretations. So what happened was that discrimination was prohibited in all international documents on other grounds. And this then allowed for gender identity to be recognized as implicitly included. It was just the fact that then since 2006, we have it specifically mentioned, creation of the concept, recognition of it in international law, but still due to probably still a lot of opposition, we only have it defined in a non-binding Yogyakarta principles. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Now, Sasha Gavric also had a question. Sasha, please.
Yeah, it's great being with you people. If the lecture would be in person, I would be not participating as I'm in Warsaw. So I'm really happy that there are positive sides of this pandemic. Thank you for the fantastic lecture. I myself have a strong LGBT activism background from Bosnia, so I'm aware of some of those developments, but it was really fantastic to have it summarized in such a holistic way. My question would be more practical than theoretical, and I wonder if you have insights. It maybe goes also beyond the scope of your lecture, but if you have insights on, in a way, yeah, maybe provocatively to call it backlash from the women's movement to the developments, in the sense, how far have these attacks based on the term gender and gender ideology have caused some form of distancing from the women's movement, from the LGBTI movement, and having a more narrow understanding, going back to the understanding of more of in a binary way, hoping, you know, that in that way that religious and conservative movements will give up a little bit on attacking women's rights, or did that not happen in so to say within the women's movements, let's say in Europe? I mean, to focus on our continent. So have you observed such forms of distancing from the women's movement, that it got stronger in the last decades, or is the women's movement still dominantly solidar with the LGBTI community, as it's a shared, so to say, battle? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. Yeah, I think you are right. I think that's one of the reasons. I think there is many different stories to some clashes between the movements, and I would say not between the movements, but between certain parts of the movements. And I think one is probably that because and let's show it on the example of the Istanbul Convention, where maybe one of the strategic decisions was to dissociate a bit, to say, okay, and I think that maybe not enough was done to challenge the transphobia, which was really shown during the Istanbul Convention, when the fear was that, as they said, men would enter female bathrooms, etc. And I think that should have been addressed. But on the other hand, it was also strategically, I think, important to say, okay, but this is the convention about violence against women primarily, no? So I think it's difficult to operate here, because how do you deal with it? You don't want to say, this fight is more important, or yeah, we have this more conservative understanding, so that maybe the states will allow this, or will have more sympathy to the Istanbul Convention if we, dissociate ourselves from this. But I think the backlash has resulted in a way by at least having to think about these questions and addressing them. But I think that there is more to it. I think there is more to why now there is some frictions. There is more, and there is more on both sides. Which I don't know if it's time to go into it. Maybe not. But what we are saying, I think it would be really. But I think still most of the movements, I think LGBT movement was mostly built on feminist. Feminist has been in solidarity with it. But also now, can we even talk about LGBTIQ movement? Because some primarily L and T, are not really working together. So there is so many layers now of complexity. But we think that there is still so much similarity, and that the oppression comes from really similar forms and similar norms, so that it would be really not wise, and not even, it's not the question of wise. It would really be against the values we are promoting if we are working against each other. And not only women and LGBT, but disabled, Roma, whatever. And this is something I've been seeing working in international human rights law for so many years, that often, there is like a marathon, how do they call it, Olympics of oppression, where only my suffering, my fight is worthy, and I don't, see or care or understand other people's experiences. But on the other hand, there is also maybe too many expectations that I would immediately understand all of the acronyms of any movement, and I think there is also something where we are seeing now immediately labeling of labels being put, where sometimes it really might be just not understanding the complexities of different people's lived experiences. And I think we all need to have more space to discuss it without a fear of being labeled as phobic in whichever way. Marija, do you want to add something?
Well, just that I think it's really important to work in solidarity and to find some inclusive discourse, and that even this talk of really defining our differences and saying who is right, who is wrong, there's really no use of that. We can speak about gender critical feminists and their understanding of gender, of problem of gender identity, and how that was built in anti-gender movements. And that is why we were saying that this whole friction inside these progressive forces really played well for them. But at the same time, I think that if we understand all people as human beings with the right to dignity, and if we start from social justice as our main goal, then there's really no problems to find a way to work together and to address real and harms that are really at this time coming to all different groups of people.
But I think want to say that I suppose from what I think feminists or some feminists might have an issue with, that now, you know, that everything is about or what they are maybe kind of afraid of, that the system that was built on the binary definition of gender and that oppressed them, that now is not simply seen as a matter of easy dismantling through choosing whatever you can. I think this is where many are coming from. Like, but keep in mind that the system was was harmful, or that there is a systematic issue include as well as an individual understanding. And I think they're not incompatible. I think, yes, we are defining internally experiences our gender identity, all of us, but it is in the context of society, which was based on the binary hierarchical system of gender as oppressing women.
Thank you. I have to say that I would agree with Sasha and with part of what you said, that there is quite some unqueering of feminism in the last, well, almost a decade. But I will now read the question from Dena Kirpalani, who asked, isn't there an advantage in leaving gender undefined or less defined, because it interrupts the law's power in entrenching notions of gender when our understanding of gender and gender identity are continuing to evolve and expand?
Yes, and I think this is what I was saying. I think there is definitely an advantage to leaving terms undefined, because who has the power to define them, and what is reflected in a definition? Only the voice of those who have access to certain definition-making spaces as well. And as you say, yeah, the world is changing. We are gaining deeper understandings of our experiences or understanding of other people's experiences. So I think there is definitely, and there is a constant struggle in law. You have to define things in order for them to be legally recognized in a way. But then on the other hand, if you define them narrowly, then you will not do justice to individual cases. And that's, the law operates with categories, and our lives are much more complex than fitting in a box. Even in terms of our identities and discrimination we face, it's of intersectional nature. So how do you then define it in a category of gender, gender identity, disability, ethnicity, whatever, when it all comes together in a way that creates a specific experience that each person has?
Please, if there are any questions, comments.
Report.
Jelena Milinovic says, report of the working group on the issue of discrimination against women in law and in practice. Jelena, can you please tell us what do you have in mind?
Yes.
Thank you.
As Ivana, hello to everybody. As Ivana is in the working group on the issue of discrimination against women in law and practice, I'd like to ask if there are some further activities to implement recommendations from the report of the working group that was adopted in July 2018.
2018.
2018.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I know the first two recommendations were exactly regarding this backlash and what to do when it comes to gender issues and gender ideology or gender mainstreaming terminology in the human rights legislation.
Yeah. Thank you, Jelena, and thanks for following our work. So yes, this was reported in 2018, which addressed quite a lot of the issues we are talking today, yes, about the backlash that was really obvious at that time. And it gave recommendations, as each of our reports does, to the different stakeholders, states, but international community as well. But here I think we can see how, unfortunately, the implementation of the human rights standards, the implementation of the reports, particularly, I would say, of the special procedures, maybe the treaty monitoring bodies fare a little better, is such a big problem. So we really have a lot of norm setting reports. We have a lot of clear standards, but how do we implement them? And yeah, I mean, we also visited Poland, and this is in, when was that? In 2019. Or 20. And we issued a number of recommendations, including liberalization of abortion, but it ended up with abortion being prohibited. So further limited. So yeah, I don't know what to say. It's very, very difficult to secure the implementation.
What about UN system? I'm sorry to interrupt, because I know that you recommended to the United Nations system to reassert the validity of terminology relating to gender issues and counter its misuse, and
yes,
maintain international law guarantees on
yeah, and this is like not, and the issues with that certain actors we have no problems with, like the human rights treaty monitoring bodies or the special procedures. We are all on the same page. Where the problem lies is with the resolutions at the Human Rights Council.
Okay.
But we are and what we are trying, and often they do take into account our reports. And there have been in each report we managed to reassert certain standards, including in relation to gender. So we use the terminology of gender. Or not we, sorry, the Human Rights Council keeps using it as well, so which is the interstate body. So at international level, I think more could be possibly done, but I think the problem is more really at the national level now. And then how international law translates to national law, which is a question which is bigger than our working group. It's a big question of, okay, how do these standards then get translated in national policies? Yeah.
I was just thinking about the different forms of pressure that United Nations system maybe can put on different states members of the United Nations. So
yeah, but also the other thing is that they are, you know, the UN is financed through the states, so I think that's also a constraint, and then it's a big question of the implementation, and there are certain measures of pressures, and of course there's always a conversation and an attempt to steer policies in a certain direction, but at the end of the day, it's a very complex system in terms of effectuating change. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Zorana wanted to say something. I don't know if she's okay. So thank you for.
I'm still here. Sorry, I couldn't. Thank you, Nadia. Let me just. Thank you. I'm in my gender role cooking lunch, but it was so interesting discussion that I couldn't restrain from asking a question or actually making a comment, because what provoked me actually is the idea of finding the same or a common ground or base for solidarity among movements, and to try to avoid Olympics of inequalities. So my question goes in direction what do you think if we try to turn the human rights system on its head in terms of dealing with sectors and areas of life where people experience different sorts of discrimination and violence, instead of talking about phase of their identities that they're experienced. What I want to say, for example, in health sector, you know, we can talk about discrimination against women, discrimination against LGBTIQ, or, you know, but these all identities or all people that are entering in this sector will have their own experience of discrimination. I don't know, what do you think about this? I mean, I tried to suggest this when 10 years ago or less, we were starting to work on supporting the new strategy for anti-discrimination, but that was rejected. And it was rejected by different NGOs and representatives of these discriminated groups. And there is this expression that you can find in a literature, opportunity coring, that actually I think prevents many groups to see a bigger picture. Sorry for taking too long, and thank you for a very inspiring and interesting lecture.
Zorana, thank you. I hope you made a good lunch while listening to us, that it was so inspiring that it's now spicy. I mean, there is also both approaches operating, at least in international human rights law. One is rights-based. So when you talk about the right to health, you know, you will be looking at these days. Previously, no, you would be looking from the perspective of abled, middle-aged white men. But these days, you would bring in intersectionality in the discussion of a certain sector, as you said, or a certain right. And then there is also the second approach is where you take a group of persons and then you look at their rights or sectors. Yeah, and the second one is usually used when you frame the issue as anti-discrimination, and the first one as rights. And what I hear you, as far as I understand, is that you were proposing in anti-discrimination strategy to actually look at it from the kind of sector or the rights perspective. And I think it's an interesting approach. Yeah, I think we need to really think of new ways to conceptualizing things. Yeah, and with an inclusivity in mind. I don't know if I can say anything more at this stage, because I don't know how that looked in practice for you, but I think it's an interesting approach.
Hi. So thank you for a really interesting presentation. So in light of a very strong backlash, which you have mapped out in detail, I guess my question is, so last week we were talking about feminism and television series, and one of the series that we were analyzing is Mrs. America, and this kind of interesting historical moment where on the one hand you are looking at a women's movement which is at a very high point, particularly in the early 70s, and then at the same time, essentially the entire series is devoted to seeing how the right wing can organize powerfully and basically not necessarily undo this work, but it can give a very serious blow. And my thing from watching that series, but also from listening to your lecture today, is maybe what are the kinds of not necessarily lessons, but what are the kinds of ideas or strategies that we can draw on, which have actually worked, which have shown to make progress, to show at least some degree of success, because we do have a series of documents that are still, at least that have been adopted. For better or for worse, we have some definitions, we have some national laws. And even in this, for me, mostly sad development where we have to now argue with other feminists on how to look at gender, we still even have some legal protections for trans people as well. So my question is, from mapping out this history of gender as a term, and particularly in legal documents, what would be the kind of strategies that you would look at and say, okay, this has been shown to work, to actually show at least some level of progress? Thank you.
Well, I can try, but in terms of propagation of gender as an important tool to analyze discrimination and oppression that women were subdued to, well, great mobilization and activism from feminists was really the thing that put that whole thing in motion. That same thing was replicated with anti-gender movements. So they were also well funded at the time. They were really organized. They used different strategies. So what works is social movements. So organization through social movements works. But one more thing that I think is really important is that we try to inform the people through various ways. Okay, education is really important. So progressive forces recognize that. Also, these regressive movements recognize that. So that's why there's a really major point of contestation. But I think that really this academic knowledge and also activists' knowledge, there's really a great whole that goes all the way to the people. So people are really, they are not understanding what are we talking about. So I think that maybe the best way is to really simplify everything and just say, okay, we really want that all people have same rights, that we are all equals. There's no differentiating things to among people, and so that's our only goal. So I think that that's some kind of way that we need to approach the public.
And maybe in relation to that, what we are seeing in a way, even though we have all these troubling developments, we are seeing, for example, that feminism is not only in activism or academia, that now it's becoming more, that now like women are talking about their experiences of harassment at universities, at schools, who are not necessarily in NGOs, or who have not had, who have not studied women's studies or anything like that, there is, I think there is a change of mentality and empowerment of women, which has been happening, not only those who choose to act politically, but those who would not define themselves as any type of policy or political actor, but who had enough of silence. And I think that's maybe something that's good and should be built now upon, so that again, solidarity, that it's really, we come again down up, because what has been a development with feminism, I think, is that more and more feminists, entered the government position, UN, etc., and sometimes completely dissociated or forgot, where things are coming from, and they're coming from the ground. So I think, we need all to be connected.
If I can add something to Nadia's and both what you both said, I don't know if you're aware of the fact that at this very moment we have 3 very important laws in this domain, which are in the preparatory phase. One of them, probably the most controversial one, although I mean they are portrayed very often as a package, the one on gender equality, the other one on anti-discrimination, and the last one on same-sex partnerships, where this one is being presented exactly as Marija said, not, well, as ljudsko pravo.
Union or unity, not a partnership. Partners are owners of kiosk, for example, but unions. I'm one in expert group, so I know what I'm talking about.
Zorice, I really wanted to, in fact, join in, especially on the grounds of what I will ask on what Marija said. I mean, our minister for all of that, for the things where these 3 laws fall in that category, she insists, for example, and she's not the only one, she insists that this is a kind of a human rights law where everyone is supposed to be treated and recognized as human. Which is of course very nice, but as we know, the human rights discourse has been abused for, again, at least a decade, and downplayed, denigrated in many ways. What I'm trying to say is that would you agree with the idea that anti-gender ideology rests on a very sound and strict discrimination between people, which would then, I mean, let's address that very openly and clearly, which would then say, yes, but not all humans are humans enough to be treated equally. Because it seems to me that, for example, we now have very strong public discourse, which puts forward very much this human rights discourse, explains the laws in that framework. But on the other hand, there is constantly the opposition to it, which somehow makes a division. Of course, it says in a very liberal manner that we have to respect privacy, that we have to respect that anyone does whatever one does in their 4 walls, within their 4 walls. But in the public, there should be a difference between what is human. So, I mean, I really wanted to include also Zorica because she is the vital person on this whole process, but also to hear your opinion on this.
Should we hear Zorica first, or should we respond?
Okay, I don't think I'm a vital person at all, but I'm just one of those expert persons engaged in preparing the law. And from time to time adding some arguments to the ministry's crew, who is very dedicated group of and very, very expert young people. I'm advised because I was thinking whoever work in any ministry must be member of parties and not very knowledgeable person. No, they were educated abroad. They had a very wide, at least those equipe who is engaged to help us, who are 3 professor experts for the law. I have to say that many attacks come to the moment from various sides and from various political platforms, most of them from conservative, homophobic people who don't want even to hear the term LGBT or to hear the term gender. This is something what is dangerous for their opinion, what is the substance of Serbian culture and Serbian tradition, etc., etc. So there are also other sources of attacks from religious communities and churches, ignoring that, for example, Greece as a country very much under influence of Orthodox Church has since a while, few years actually, not many years, law on same-sex unities. including Israel, also with the highly present Judaist structures, religious structures, also has it since many years in this time. So anyway, also from the side of so-called human rights are also a tool which which is not only abused through decades. This is also an instrument of Cold War, of fighting between so-called free world and the communist world. But also human rights were the tool to help thousands of people, even 100,000 people, to escape repression in their countries, particularly in former Soviet Union, today in some Asian countries, and also Russia, also Turkey. So be aware that all these people, due to internationally use or misuse the term human rights, are now were safe and were somehow saved from worse repressions. So I don't think human rights is something bad or something something what is particular in this situation misused. I know that human rights as a concept could be misused, the gender could be misused as well, but in this situation, this is way of defending attacks. Have in mind that the ministry and the minister, Ms. Chomic, and all of us practically, but don't want to put myself in any kind of focus. All they were under a very strong attack, and it is only the way how to defend themselves. Okay, this is, they could not say this is family because of this conservative sides in fear that some kind of family, same-sex families will become part of our legal system. So she said, no, in fact, it is a human rights issue. This is not issue of marriage, this is not issue of adoption of children, because the most of arguments came from that side. We will see what kind of, now I'm getting just from the minister one message. We are all in contacts, and I'm completely aware of all sorts of attacks. And the worst for me came, I expect conservative and homophobic people, okay. But the worst for me and the most painful for me were attacks from political points of view, people who simply don't like this government, what is legitimate, but the people who negate anything, whatever this government is doing is bad, whatever law they plan to enact is bad. And this came also from the feminist sides. I have to say simply, I'm not fan of this government and not fan of any government. Being a researcher and scientist, I'd rather stay on the skeptical side regarding everybody. But I like this Chinese proverb, doesn't matter which color is the cat, if the cat hunts mice. This cat is able to hunt the mice of gender equality, same-sex unities, and anti-discrimination law, thanks them. So we will see. In fact, the conclusion will be at the parliamentary session in May. So we have to survive this ugly month of April, and I don't know how many days in May. But I don't know, did I answer you? But simply I tried to put more lights on the whole situation. At the end, we will have, I strongly hope, counting of huge huge majority in the parliament that we would have this law enacted. And also a few years ago, we had similar discussions in regard of Pride Parade, for example. The same arguments, literally the same arguments were used by same actors, homophobic, conservative, nationalistic, etc. Now we have it since 2013-14, I don't remember, and nothing worse, nothing bad happened. Simply it happened and nobody really paid attention. So I do hope I think nobody from the sides of opponents. I do think it would be the conclusion of our situation nowadays. These three laws will be enacted. We will somehow survive. Physically, yes, mentally a little bit harder, but yes, of course. And then we will, this country and the people of this country, women, LGBT, all marginalized and all discriminated people would have these three laws to improve our lives. I don't think that the law is the first and most necessary step. And I know that we have many laws which are not anyhow functional in practice, but let's say this first step is necessary. And if anybody don't remember who asked, and now I'm going to finish, who asked how to introduce gender, yes, by the way of law. I'm a lawyer, so I do believe in laws. If we will have the law titled Law on Gender Equality and not law on equality of men and women, or not law on sex equality, but law on gender equality, what is the current title of the draft law, we will make the first step towards introducing gender in our legal system and our practice. I don't think it will go easily and quickly, but let's say the first step will be here. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Zorica. And before I just give you the word, I just want to say that it would be interesting to invite you all for our next session on the 3rd of May, which is going to talk precisely about how the Constitutional Court proclaimed gender unconstitutional Bulgaria, so that we see what can happen with that. But Ivana and Marija, please, if you want to say something on the line of humanity, human rights, and being human in public.
But I think you're right. I think it's, even though the anti-gender movements use the human rights argument to say, that this is jeopardizing the right to family, tradition, religion, etc., that basically, that they're undermining the full inclusion of certain humans in the public space, which is undermining in the way their full humanity. And I think it's good to, when they are talking about gender ideology being promoted through feminism, the question is what we were trying to say is, but you are promoting a certain kind of gender ideology, which is the patriarchal order, gender order. So there is already ideology that is being promoted. So just kind of to turn that upside down and to say, what you are promoting in terms of the division of sexes and the complementarity and binary view, etc., is a certain gender ideology. So yeah, patriarchal gender ideology.
Okay, if there is no more questions or comments, I would like us to, in fact, think of one maybe slippage, or maybe Marija really wanted to put it that way. At some point, she said we have a debate or maybe war on gender. And I would like us to really leave this lecture with this thought in mind. Are we just having a debate? Is that debate an academic one? Is that debate a public one, some kind of general public one where everyone has the right to participate and where all the arguments are being heard? Or are we really in some kind of war? and who is in fact instigating that war. Is that the anti-gender ideology or the so-called gender ideology? I think this lecture really mapped in a very comprehensive and nice way these issues for us to think about them. Thank you, Ivana and Marija. It was really magnificent, and thank you all of you who were with us, especially the discussants. And I hope to see you all in somewhat less than a month.
And I just want to say I'm impressed by Adriana, by all the work you are doing, and thank you for your work and all these great people who are here. Some of them I know are legends of the movement, and it's really good. To see that there is still 30 people willing to listen to this. Thank you. So hopefully we see. Hopefully I come in May to this lesson.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.